Out of history, from the beginning of Genesis through the ages of ancestors and kings and prophets, from the announcement of angels and seers, we come to the fulfillment of God's purpose in Jesus Christ. Born at Christmas, we skip his childhood and arrive today in the Gospel according to Mark at the beginning of Jesus' mission. 4 disciples are already called, Peter and Andrew, James and John. And then comes another unlikely sort, Levi, the son of Alphaeus, a tax collector. The story of Jesus is a tale of God making things right, of God interceding in history and intervening in personal circumstances, which means the status quo is not good enough, which means things are going to change. And it begins with a man paralyzed, dropped through the roof. We're told in the first verse of chapter 2 that Jesus has a home, that he has made his home at Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is at home, but guests keep showing up. So many guests that they crowd the living room and sitting squished on the sofa, and people crammed in corners and doorways so tight that no one can move. Now, a person paralyzed needed to get close, but can't push through this tight crowd. He had some pals who had an idea. They hoisted him on to the roof, jostled and jerked up the wall, and then resting a moment to catch their breath. Now, I imagine the paralytic thinking that this is not so good, that he preferred to stay close to the ground where he would not fall, that climbing walls is not something paralytics should do, that a thatched roof of sticks and straw won't hold 5 guys. It could be that the guy's pals thought this was a lark, a funny joke to play on Jesus. More likely, though, the pals suspected what Jesus could do. More likely, they ignored the protests of the paralytic and dragged him to the roof anyway. And then they tore apart Jesus' roof. My guess is that vandalism is frowned upon even in those days. But Jesus doesn't seem to care. Instead, he sees a man in need and saw the faith of the guy's pals. And Jesus forgives his sin. This past week, the confirmation class, and Jacob was there, yeah. This past week, the confirmation class discussed the petition of the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. The usual default thinking among most Christians today is that this is about personal sin. What harm takes place between 2 people, and that forgiveness is about 2 people reconciling. But there is a sin of much greater magnitude. There is sin in circumstances that no one person's personal fault. Jesus came to redeem the world, not just relationship between 2 people. There's a kind of sin that infects society, that invades circumstances. And you know that kind of sin. That in the harsh cold of Minnesota winters, there are children who sleep on the streets. That is sin. That in our so-called freedom, circumstances are weighed against brown people, and our prisons are disproportionately people of color. That is sin. That with all the riches of our nation and the excellence of medical research and proliferation of hospitals and insurance companies, there are some who do not have access to health care. And that is sin. There's a kind of sin that infects society, sin in the way things are. And Jesus came to save all the world. Jesus came to make things right. So a paralytic is dropped through the roof, not sure this is a good idea. And Jesus tells him that his sin is forgiven. Well, what sin did the paralytic do exactly to be forgiven? Nothing is noted about what the paralytic did. I think Jesus is forgiving the greater societal sin that does not make room for a person disabled. I think Jesus is forgiving the greater societal sin of people privileged to arrive first who will not move aside for someone else. I think Jesus is looking in the eye those crowding in his home and passing judgment on their self-interest that will not let another one in. He says to the paralytic, "My son, your sins are forgiven." Not so much what you did to bring about this paralysis, some foolishness about that brought injury, but the sin in which you now find yourself where your own neighbors have turned their backs on you. So this injustice shall be no more. Get up, take your mat, go home. Circumstances are changed. People will not ignore you anymore. You shall not be shut out anymore. You will take your rightful place among all the others. What follows is Jesus insisting that old ways of societal sin are over, that the status quo is not good enough, that things are going to change. And then he does something that shocks them all. Jesus changed up the practical ways of the world. You know, it makes worldly sense to love those who are like you, who are good to you, and to suspect those who may be different from you, and to despise those whose lifestyle offends you, and to avoid those who might harm, to hate the one who betrays your core values. But Jesus changes it up and demands that we love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. The hardest enemy to love is perhaps the one who most like us, and yet who betrays everything we are about. The hardest enemy to love is perhaps the one who betrays his own people. And that is who tax collectors were in the time of Jesus. They were Jews who worked for the Roman invaders. They were townspeople who turned on their neighbors and worked against them. Tax collectors lived an existence of shame that they had chosen the privilege of money over affection of friends. An existence of constant vigilance against everyone's anger. An existence of looking in the eye of a struggling poor person and taking their money. An existence of heart hardened and caring not for anything. Howard Thurman wrote a while back in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, that Jesus demonstrated that the only way to redeem them was to penetrate their thick resistance to public opinion and lay bare that simple heart. This man is not just a tax collector. He is a son of God. And Jesus says, love your enemies and do good to them who hate you. Hence he called Levi, the tax collector, to follow him. The calling of Levi was an intentional act of seeing him not as a despised outcast, but as a child of God. The one common quality to all of Jesus' followers is that each one is a child of God. In calling Levi, changed in Levi's mind, this world that he knew. No longer living fearful of neighbors, suspected and despised, to living out his ancestral identity as God's beloved. Jesus, calling a tax collector to be his disciple, ran against every moral principle and every patriotic duty. There are enemies and there are allies. The world is divided between those like us and the rest are enemies. And their nation is divided between those we are supposed to love and those we are supposed to hate. And Jesus changes it up. God has entered history to make things right. God brings judgment that things have gone wrong and justice to make it right. And the status quo is not good enough. New wineskins. The old ways do not work. Now look at what the new wine that Jesus brings. New wine is a world where suspicion shrinks. A world where enemies are heard and differences respected. A world of plenty for all. A world where worry gives way to assurance. See the new wine that Jesus brings, changing up scarcity and stress to an attitude of generosity and gift. Changing up a sense of loss to confidence in God's promise to bear with us. Changing up demands and obligations to personal passion embedded in God's good work. The new wine and the new ways Jesus brings is freedom from the constraints of the past. The new way Jesus brings is forgiving above all the ingrained societal sin that we all put up with. The new way Jesus brings is forgiveness that changes one's personal situation, yes, but even more powerful, that forgiveness that changes the status quo itself, changes up prevailing attitudes of division and fear and injustice. A way of life that sees enemies as neighbors, troubles as opportunities, an uncertain future as adventure to explore. New wine, new way, new day.